Number 1.
This happened about 5 to 6 years ago. I was 15 at the time, male, just to note. Now, I've heard from my mum about pedophiles and predators a lot when I was young. Never get into one's car no matter what they offer you and so on. You know the drill. I never got snatched, and the older I got, the safer I started to feel. I mean, who would want to rape a pimply teenage boy? At that time, I was sure that the danger of getting snatched and raped was over. Let's get on with the encounter. I was an asshole as a teen, compensating for a youth of the glasses plus braces combo, I suppose. Anyways, it was one of those days that I decided to skip the first few hours of school to sleep in. So, I took the train 3 hours later at a time where all the kids are in school already, and the train was completely empty. I enter on my stop, start listening to music and relax. While dreaming around, I noticed the elbow of a person wearing a jacket a few seats in front of me. After another station, the person stood up from their seat, looked around, and came to sit right next to me. It was an elderly man, not old but oldish, 55 to 58 years old I would guess, balding with white hair. Even though I was an asshole, I valued manners since I came from a pretty good family, so I took my earbuds out and greeted the man. He greeted me back, but looked at me strangely. Nobody has ever looked at me like that. Later on in my life, I realized that this was a look of lust. It sounds weird, but it's something real. You notice it in someone's eyes. As I attempt to continue listening to music, he starts up a conversation, despite my signal that I would like to be alone. He tells me that he's returning from a long night of gambling in the big city near my station, and that he won big money. I congratulate him, and actually got more interested in the conversation since I have never talked to a gambler before. We engage in a casual talk, and at some point he tells me that his new dishwasher was standing in front of his door, and that he could not lift it, and if I could get off one station earlier to help him, being an old man and all. I tell him that I have to get to school and apologize. He offers me $50. I tell him no. He says $150, and that he really needs help. Basically, I will just have to get into his apartment, remove the old one, and help him get the new one up. Simple. At this point, I'm getting suspicious. I lived in southern Germany back then, and people are very friendly around these parts. You could easily ask your neighbors to help, and most would gladly take the time out of their day to help. I asked him if he has any relatives or anyone else that can help him, but whatever angle I tried, it ended up with me going back to his home. The situation was getting super intense, and I just wanted to go, but I really felt like he would try to stop me if I just stood up. And who was going to help me in an empty train 10 minutes away from the next stop? He noticed that I was very nervous and offered me even more money, €200 to help him. No money in the world could get me into this guy's home. He seemed way too murder-rapey. So, I figured the perfect plan. He would not engage me when I was on the phone, so while my music was playing, I pretended like I was just moving my hand in my pocket like you do it. After a few minutes of super awkward talk, a new song was about to start and I unplugged my headphones. The new song started up on speakers and I pretended I was taking a call. I excused myself and stood up, turned off the music, walked out of the wagon to the exit part pretending to have a conversation with my father. I saw people waiting for the train as we were closing in on the station, 3 more to my school station and 2 more for this guy's station. I decided it was time to make a move. Creepy guy was waving at me from time to time, and I ignored him. The train stops at the station. Creepy guy is standing up, coming towards me. I literally jump out of the train and make a run for it. I looked back as I turned the corner and saw him leaving the train. I've never ran this fast before. I ran until I couldn't breathe anymore, called my mother to pick me up, and never talked about it again. Don't ask me why I didn't talk about it, or report it. I guess I thought it was silly reporting a possible rapist as a teenage male. I like to calm myself by thinking about him just as an old gambler in the need of someone helping him out with his dishwasher up the stairs. But deep down, I knew this was not what I would like it to have been.
Number 2.
This happened when I was either 5 or 6 years old. I have Asperger's, although I went undiagnosed for my entire childhood. My grandmother, who raised me, was very old school, and I think the idea that her granddaughter was quote-unquote flawed child was unthinkable. Anyway, part of my condition is that I have a difficult time picking up on subtle social cues. As a kid, this made me extremely gullible, and I tended to believe whatever people told me at face value. A lot of backstory, I know, but it's important to understand the context of the story, not to mention what got me into the situation in the first place. So, one Saturday afternoon, I was playing in the fenced area of my grandmother's front yard. Normal kid stuff mostly. I think I had my Barbies with me. All of a sudden, this neighborhood kid I didn't know pokes his head over the fence and says, "Hello." He was twice my age, dark hair, dark eyes. I can't remember his name, so for the sake of the story, I'll be calling him John. Now, stranger danger was something that was drilled into our heads over and over again at school, but it was always about adults. No one ever once warned us about going anywhere with kids we didn't know. At some point, I told John that it was getting too hot to play outside, and I was going inside to play video games on my then brand new NES. This was when he told me that he had a bunch of NES cartridges to give me for free if I went over to his house. Thank God, my grandmother had more sense than a 5-year-old autistic kid. She told me that the only way I was going to a 12-year-old boy's house was if she knew where his house was and his phone number. John happily complied with this request. But even my grandmother didn't suspect that John not only had deliberately given her the wrong address, but the wrong phone number as well. As we were walking to John's house, he suddenly turned straight towards a wooded area behind the houses lining a curve in the road. Even as a gullible kid, I suspected something was up. I asked John why we weren't going to his house. "I actually lied," he admitted. "I don't live in a house. My parents are dead." For most normal kids, this would be a sign to note the fuck out. If a kid's parents were dead, no way in hell would he be living in the woods in Arizona. But between my age and my disorder, I not only believed John, but I pitied him too. He told me he still had the cartridges for me, and like an idiot I believed him and followed him into the woods. After about 30 minutes of following John, I knew something was seriously wrong. The alarm bells were finally going off. I told him I wanted to go home. I didn't want his NES cartridges anymore. After a pause, John said, "Okay," and started leading me back the way we came. But he kept stopping, moving in false starts, looking around. Finally, he said that he'd made a mistake and now he was lost. This made me mad and scared. I knew he was lying. I told him to take me back to my grandma's house now that it was hot and I was really thirsty. By this time, it was late afternoon at around 4. This is where I look back and get seriously creeped out. John looked at me and smiled. "You thirsty? Why didn't you say so?" He led the way to a leftover rain puddle that hadn't been dried up yet. I stared at him. Did he really expect me to drink from that? "I don't have a cup," I told him. "Just get down and drink it like a dog," he asked. I got down on my knees, but I only took the water to cool off with. Even as a little kid, I knew you're never supposed to drink dirty water. While I was wetting my forehead and neck down to cool off, John started churning up the water to make it muddy, still trying to convince me it was fine and that I should lap it up like a dog. After a while, I realized I could hear a familiar sound. The major highway that ran perpendicular to the road that led into my neighborhood. Looking down the hill we were on, I could even just barely make out the cars traveling down it. I didn't even hesitate. I ran all the way down that hill with John calling after me. I couldn't hear what he said, and I didn't care. If I found the highway, I could find my way back home. I climbed a barbed wire fence and ripped a hole in the pants I was wearing, getting to the highway. John caught up to me once I reached the sidewalk, telling me to come back into the woods with him. "No," I shouted at him. "I'm going home." At this point, a police car came up to where we were standing. My grandma had called the number John gave her only to find out it was the wrong number. When she went to the house he described and it was the wrong one, she called the police. So this cop asked my name and I told him. He said my grandma was worried about me, and I was so happy to see him that I started crying. Then another car pulled up. A woman stuck her head out of the window. "John, get your ass into this car right now." My stomach dropped. I looked up at John. "I thought you said you lived in the woods." The woman's face contorted further in her anger. "No, he doesn't live in the woods. I'm his mother." At this point, the cop told both of them to stay put, and he put me into his car. I couldn't hear what was being said, but in the end, the cop let John get into his mother's car and he drove me home. My grandma was plenty pissed at me for going with John after he told me he lived in the woods, but I think she was just glad to have me back unharmed. It wasn't until years later that I realized just how fucked up the entire situation was. To this day, I don't know why John wanted to lure a 5-year-old girl into the woods, but I'm glad I never found out. Number 3. It was about November 2012 in Houston, Texas. I was taking night classes to become a medical assistant. I was driving a VW Passat, kinda girly, I know. I had just left school at about 10:15 PM. I had some homework I had questions over, blah blah blah. I had to stop at a Walgreens for an RX. There's really only one 24-hour Walgreens near my home, and it's right down the street from my school. I'm wearing royal blue scrubs, my student ID, and I'm tired. Getting my RX in the back of the store, I'm not really paying attention to my surroundings, but then someone caught my eye. It was this guy. He kinda stood at the end of each aisle I was on, but I thought he was there doing the same thing I was. Anyway, I head up to the register because I had a few other items I had gotten, not just the RX, and I realized this guy has walked right past me and is standing outside near the trash cans at the entrance. As I'm walking to my car, I see him pick up his phone and he's watching me, hardcore. I can kind of read lips and he was describing my appearance, car, build, all that, to someone on the phone. So I get in my car, start it, and he does the same. Now, it's worth noting this Walgreens is 2 blocks away from the courthouse and the sheriff's office. I drive straight there once I get my shit together in my car. This guy followed me in his vehicle before realizing where I'm actually going, the courthouse/the sheriff's. I park, run inside, ask to speak to an on-duty officer, explain what had happened and what was happening. He takes a statement from me. I describe the man in almost perfect detail, and he offers me an escort home. We drive home, him a few cars' length behind me, and we make it there with no hiccups or no reappearance of the guy and his shitty Toyota Corolla. I park in my driveway, he circles around my cul-de-sac. When he gets back to my house, he calls me over to the patrol car. He has his laptop up with this guy's mugshot and record right there. He asks, "Is this the man?" and I nod yes. What he told me next still freaks me the absolute fuck out. As we were driving to my house, the other sheriffs in the area found him, pulled over, searched the car and found a young girl about my age, 19 at the time, in his trunk. He was known in the area for pimping and was trying to get me as a possible prostitute of his. I'm not going into too many details for obvious reasons, but at the time I lived in a very well-to-do suburb of Houston. This kind of thing does not happen there. Or should I say, the news does not report it there.
Number 4.
In August, I moved to my friend's apartment. I graduated from a university and was offered a job as a teacher, and was well on my way to figuring out this whole adult life. I moved in with a longtime friend, and neither of us had any complaints about our apartment complex. Our complex is very nice. It's in a wonderful part of town, but it's truly a diamond in the rough. The complex is well maintained, clean, and the other members have been nothing but friendly. To get into our complex, there are 2 gates. If you live at the apartments, you're given a remote that opens the gate of your choosing, but if you don't live at the complex, you have to go through a directory at the front to find the name of the resident you're looking for. Once you find the resident's name, it calls the resident's phone and gives the resident a few options. The resident can choose to talk to the person who has called them and decide to let them in by entering in their key code into the dial pad on their cell phone, or they can hang up and the gates will not be opened. Overall, I think this system helped to save me from the situation that I got myself into. One night in October, I was driving home from my fiance's house. It was late at night, probably close to 2 a.m. I had just gone off of the freeway and was about to enter into my neighborhood when I was stopped at a traffic light. I was in the left-hand turn lane, and there was another car in the right-hand turn lane, 2 lanes away from me. The light changed to a green arrow and I proceeded to turn left, and the car, which had previously been in the right-hand turn lane, maneuvered to follow me. I thought this was weird because of how many lanes they cut across, but I figured they were just lost, so I tried not to think much of it. I continued driving down the road and was about to take a right-hand turn into my neighborhood, and was distressed to see the car turn in behind me. Still, I ignored my gut feeling and figured they lived in the neighborhood around my complex. I remember thinking that they were driving just a little bit too close, but again, I tried to not let my anxiety get the best of me. I do have anxiety, so I figured it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I remember from reading stories on Reddit that the best way to tell if someone is following you is by turning right multiple times to form a square of sorts. I talked myself out of this maneuver. I wish I hadn't. I sped up just a bit, clicked my gate open, and pulled into the complex. The car following me whipped in right behind me. Again, I convinced myself this was normal. They probably lived in the complex too, right? The gate opens up in the opposite side of the apartments, so you have to drive through the entire complex to get to where my apartment is. I drove through quickly. I was prepared to exit the complex just in case the person was still following me, but when I looked at the straightaway right behind me, I realized that there weren't any headlights following me anymore. I laughed at myself for being so nervous and pulled into my parking spot in front of my building. As I parked and prepared to get out of the car, I turned for one last look and realized that the car that had been following me had reappeared with their headlights off, and they parked in an unreserved spot just a bit down from my own. I knew that I should have turned my car back on and drove away. I knew that there were so many other things I should have done, but in a moment of panic, I jumped out of my car and ran up the stairs into my apartment. I double-locked the doors, grabbed a knife and ran into my room to call my fiancée. I heard someone shouting from outside, but I refused to listen to what they were saying as I told my fiancée what had just happened. I suddenly heard more vicious shouting, and then it was silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I remember not being able to stand because my knees were shaking so much, and I tried to stop myself from crying so I would be able to see if someone broke down my door. My fiancé made it to my apartment in record time, with a baseball bat for me to help ease my mind. He stayed that night and let me sleep with the lights on. I couldn't get the sound of the screaming out of my head. It was obvious they were calling for someone, and I figured it must have been me. I assumed the other person screaming must have been another resident who was trying to make the other person be quiet during the early morning hours. I figured the whole situation was over until I woke up in the morning. When I walked downstairs to my car, I discovered that one of my tires had been viciously slashed to ribbons. I then realized that I had left some mail with my name on it in my car in my hurry to exit the night before. I didn't think much of that detail until later. I got my tire fixed and tried to push that night out of my mind. A few days later, however, I started to receive calls from the directory in front of my building to let someone in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered and asked who was calling for me. I was met with silence, so I hung up and didn't grant access to the complex. Again, I was called and the same procedure was repeated. Again, no one answered. They called obsessively from the call box directory for days. I finally snapped into the phone for them to tell me who they were, and a man answered. He told me that he lived in the complex and needed to be let in because he lost his key. He told me he lived in the apartment next to me. I knew the family who lived next to me. There was a woman with 4 children, but no man. And if he really did live there and lost his key, he would have been able to call himself to open the gate. I told him I didn't believe him and just hung up just as he started screaming at me to let him in. The calls continued. Finally, I had enough. I marched into the office the next day and asked him to take my number off of the directory. The man was unable to call me now, and I felt at peace. I warned the office about the man who had damaged my car, and they increased security rounds in the complex for a few months. As anticlimactic as it is, this was the last contact I had with the weirdo, thankfully. I know how I handled the situation by not listening to my gut when it told me something was wrong got me into this trouble. And I allowed someone to follow me, learn my name, and they were able to torment me for a few weeks before I finally took action. I'm just thankful to my fiancé and the staff at my apartment for taking action to help me stop the creep from being able to contact me.
Hey guys, it's the Grim Reader here. I hope you enjoyed listening through that. If you did, please slap a like, and if you haven't already, why not subscribe to be notified of future uploads? If you have a story you want me to narrate, please send it to my email in the description box. Once again, thanks a lot for listening.